All right, guys. Now, in order to understand where all of our reasoning around evolution comes from, we've got to look at a couple of important theories that have been developed over time. So in class, we're going to talk about the difference between a theory and a law in science. So that word theory is important. But here in your notes, I just want to show you what those theories are so that you can think about them a little bit closer. Remember that the simplest form of the definition of the theory of evolution is that species change over time. And we specifically talk about evolution through natural selection. And what that means is that species change over time in response to their environment. Now, let me ask you a quick question. This is just yes, no. Do you think that environments change over time? Well, yeah, of course they do, right? Can you give me some examples of environments changing over time? Yeah, I mean, certainly, if you think about global warming, that's a really good example of environments changing over time. Or if you think about melting ice caps, that's a really good example of environments changing over time. What evolution argues is that species respond to those changes by adapting and changing over time. So, scale of 1 to 5, how much sense does that make to you? I asked you that in an earlier part of our notes, and you probably are a 5 on that, right? Well, this thinking about species changing over time in response to their environment actually started with this guy named Charles Darwin. And Darwin really truly believed, he's called the father of evolution, he really truly believes that if you track far enough back in an evolutionary family tree, you can start to find common ancestors for lots of animals and plants, both. He also believed that species would have random mutations. And a mutation is exactly what you think it is. Some oddball baby that was born with some different physical feature. That's a mutation. And they happen accidentally through our genes. Sometimes our genes go through a mutation. And what Darwin said is sometimes those mutations, those unique features that come with a genetic mutation, are actually beneficial to the organism that gets it. So the baby that's born with the unique feature is able to survive and thrive in a way that other creatures aren't able to survive and thrive. Okay? So, and when those beneficial mutations are then passed on to the next generation. So parents pass on the new and unique structure to their offspring, and then those parents pass it on to their offspring. Now, what Darwin argued is that eventually you get like a snowball of mutations, and over the course of time, the creature that you have is extremely different than from the creature that you started with. It's a completely unique new structure made up of a bunch of different beneficial mutations passed down over time. So that was Darwin's argument. Now, he came up with an argument in a really interesting place. There are a series of islands off the coast of Ecuador that are called the Galapagos Islands. And by the way, they're still there today. So if you're a scientist, that maybe put that on your bucket list of places to visit. And what he said was that, or what he noticed while he was visiting the Galapagos, is that on different islands, there were the same kind of species of bird. They were called finches. And what was different about the finches, he noticed, was the shape of their beaks. And you can see the shape of those beaks down in that graphic on this particular slide, right over here. Some of the finches had really pointy beaks, while other finches had larger, rounder beaks. And Darwin could tell that they were related with each other. You know, he knew that they were all finches, but he didn't understand why they had different beaks. And so as he studied those finches, he found something amazing they all ate different food sources. Different foods were available on each of the islands where the finches were living. So on the island where this guy lived with the pointy beak, bugs, insects were the primary food source for the finches. Can you think about why a pointy beak might be useful if you're going to be eating bugs? Yeah, right. The answer is you got to be able to grab those guys. And a pointy beak is probably better at grabbing, right? Meanwhile, these finches that had the bigger, wider beaks lived on islands where both nuts and berries were the more common food source for the finches. Well, can you imagine why a bigger, wider beak is more valuable for an animal that's primary food source is berries and nuts? Well, sure, of course. Like, the wider beak is going to give you more crunching power, so you can break the nuts open, and then it's also going to give you a bigger ability to grab, some form of berry, right? You can pick it up better if you've got a wider beak. Good luck feeding a berry in the beak of a small pointy beak. So for Darwin, that was evidence that these animals had adapted to their physical surroundings. Like, if you live on an island with bugs as your primary food source, you better develop a different kind of beak if you plan to survive. How cool is that, right? That was his original thinking was inspired by the unique beaks on these different birds that lived on different islands in the Galapagos. Does that feel convincing to you? Because, again, remember, the whole purpose of this entire section of our unit is for you to decide whether or not this notion of evolution by natural selection, change over time in response to the environment, makes sense to you. I feel pretty good about that. I mean, that to me seems like relatively convincing evidence. Now, you can see that here, too. Let's talk about that in another example outside of the finches. In this particular graphic, maybe you've got a population of rabbits living in a particular habitat, and that population has some diversity of color. There's some white rabbits, there's some gray rabbits, there's some brown rabbits. Now, the white rabbits stand out, don't they? That is not a beneficial mutation. That's a quirk in the genes that created a trait that isn't very helpful. And it's not helpful because in that same habitat you've got wild dogs or foxes. So the wild dog and the fox is cruising around. He sees the white rabbit a whole lot easier. Guess who gets eaten? Right? The white rabbits get eaten first. That's because they have a mutation that's harmful. And if you have a mutation that's harmful, it's not going to help you to survive and thrive and reproduce. So the good news, I guess, for the rabbit population is that when all of these white rabbits die out, they can't reproduce. So they don't pass that unhelpful mutation down to their offspring. Instead, the rabbits that are surviving are the brown rabbits. And over the course of time, those brown rabbits, because they have a helpful mutation, will pass that helpful mutation down to their offspring. So that was part of Darwin's theory, is that helpful mutations will spread over time because the animals with the helpful mutations will be able to pass those beneficial traits down to their offspring. How much sense does that make to you? Again, right? That's the whole purpose of this unit, is for you to start to think about how convincing the evidence is. Right? Here's the second page, right? Over time, goodbye to the white bunnies. And you've got tons of brown bunnies left over because they have a helpful trait. Darwin argues that this happens in the natural world all the time. Animals are constantly responding to their environmental conditions. They're constantly evolving in response to their environmental conditions. Well, the next logical question becomes, how does environment change? What are some ways that environment has changed over time? And for that, we've got to go all the way back to 6th grade. Now, you remember when we were in 6th grade that all of the continents on Earth at one point or another were jammed together into a supercontinent, right? Random trivia question, do you remember the name of that supercontinent? Yeah, it was Pangaea. And what scientists believe is that over time, those tectonic plates have moved apart from each other. And the reason, if you remember from 6th grade, is because there is movement in the mantle underneath the tectonic plates. You know, the second layer of the Earth is the mantle, and it's made up of semi-molten material. Scientists believe that heat is moving through that mantle, and the plates which sit on top are being pushed around as a result. The example I always used in class is like the luggage cart or the luggage carousel at the airport. Your suitcases are sitting on top of a moving cart, so they can't stop. You know, the carrier, the racks that are moving your luggage around are going to keep moving, and that means your luggage is going to move too. Well, the tectonic plates on Earth are sitting on top of something that's always moving as well, so they get pushed around. Now, that's all science from 6th grade. You should have known that. But here's what's interesting. Here's how it connects to evolution. As those plates move around, they're moving in and through different climate zones. So a plate that maybe started out in the Arctic could now be at the equator, just because the plates have moved over millions of years. Well, if you were on that plate in the very beginning when it was in the Arctic, you're going to need very different structures in order to be able to survive and thrive than you do now when that exact same plate is sitting on top of the equator. That's crazy, right? So plate tectonics plays a role in evolution. As plates move, they move through different climatic zones, which causes plants and animals to adapt. Thankfully, plate tectonics happens over millions of years, right? Those plates move slowly, so plants and animals have lots of time to adapt. If they moved faster, I'm not sure that plants and animals would have the time to adapt to the new climate conditions. Now, there's something else in play here, too. Sea levels have changed over time. And they change because as our planet gets warmer, the water expands. And when our planet cools down, and we've had that happen, right? You've seen the Ice Age movies. As our planets get colder, the water on Earth contracts. It comes closer together. That's 6th grade science too. When you heat up molecules, they expand. When you cool down molecules, they contract. Well, the result of that is our sea level rises and our sea level falls depending on the climate. How crazy is that? And as the sea level rises, it may take over areas that were once land. Think about Florida, right? There's all kinds of conversations about how if the sea level continues to rise, the city of Miami in Florida might eventually be underwater again. There's all kinds of coastal cities that are in the same boat. People even worry that someday New York City might end up completely flooded as sea levels rise. Well, it's not just a climate change issue, it's an evolution issue, because if sea levels rise and consume areas that were once land, the living organisms that are there are going to have to adapt or die, right? It's one or the other. You either become a creature that's comfortable with lots of water, or you're going to die off. And the animals that have beneficial mutations that allow them to handle higher levels of salty water, those guys are going to survive. And they're going to pass their ability to survive in salty water down to their offspring. So that's what scientists argue is happening. We see changes in species as those species respond to changes in their environment. And some changes in the environment keep happening over time. Plate tectonics doesn't stop just because we wish it would. It's not just an ancient thing, it's happening today. You know, sea level rise is something that's happening today. And both of those things are going to cause species to have to adapt to new conditions. And the animals with the helpful mutations are going to be able to do that. And the ones with the unhelpful mutations, them guys are going to die. They're going to go extinct. That's interesting, right? What I think is really cool about all of this stuff is that we can see those things happening today, and we know that those things happened in the past. So that's how we're able to kind of look at a fossil and say, here's what the climate conditions must have been like during the time of this fossil. And we can guess that based on the fact that we understand what kinds of changes are happening on Earth today. That helps us to explain some of what we see in the fossil record. I think that's fascinating. Another way that we can see that is through the types of fossils that are found in different places. You probably remember this from 6th grade, right? Like, how did Alfred Wegener argue that plate tectonics was a thing? Well, he found fossils of ferns in Greenland. That's a type of plant that grows in the rainforest. That means that Greenland had to be in a warm place at some point or another. So that fossil record helps us to sort of make predictions about where continents were, too. What we see in the fossils gives us hints about where the land must have been, and where the land must have been gives us hints about what the animals must have been like in those particular places. I think it's really cool to see a 6th grade theory coming back and helping us to understand an 8th grade concept. That's neat to me. All right, the very last theory, and this one is so easy to understand. I think it's interesting because it sounds fancy, right? The law of superposition. When we first looked at your unit overview sheets, I bet you had no idea what this was. But it's really simple. The law of superposition says that, generally speaking, sediment is laid down in horizontal layers. Now, you know from an earlier section in this unit that sometimes those layers can be interrupted. But in theory, sediment's always laid down in horizontal layers on top of each other, and it builds up over time. And we can have thousands of layers of sediment in areas. Now, what's cool is we also know that the sediment that is at the bottom is older than the sediment that is on the top. And the reason that's helpful to us is because it allows us to get an estimate of the age of fossils that we find. So we can watch the progress of an organism from bottom to top. We can see how the fossil has changed from bottom to top. And we can know that that is change that is happening over time. How do we know that it's change that happens over time? Well, because sediment is deposited over time. That's something we do know. How do we know that older organisms are underneath newer organisms or organisms that are at the top? How do we know that? Well, because we know that the sediment at the bottom was deposited first. And the organism just happened to be trapped in the sediment that's down at the bottom. That gives us, we call that relative dating. We talked about that in this unit, right? It gives us the ability to make some predictions about how old things are. That's really a simple concept, but so important for understanding what's happening in our evolutionary history. It gives us the ability to predict and guess whether something is older or younger when we find it in the ground. Now, this is just a graphic that you've seen once before already that reminds you that not all layers stay horizontal forever. Sometimes they're interrupted by intrusions. Sometimes they're destroyed by erosion. Sometimes you have some folding or faulting that happens that causes those layers not to be horizontal anymore. But if scientists are aware that that process is happening, then they can make adjustments in their observations about where they're finding things too. So do those theories convince you at all? Like, does it make sense to you that older rock is deposited at the bottom and younger rock is deposited at the top? And if so, does it make sense to you that older organisms would be trapped in the rock at the bottom and younger organisms would be trapped in the rock at the top? And if that makes sense to you, can you get why we can look at the changes in fossils over time? Does it make sense to you that we really can study how a horse's foreleg has changed over millions of years because we're able to find fossils of horses in different layers of sediment? So, and does it make sense to you that environments and climates are changing over time because our tectonic plates are moving around? So if so, like those are the theories that we use to kind of argue that evolution through natural selection really is something that happened. So you've got to decide how convincing that is to you. Is that an explanation that you can buy into as well? All right, we've only got one section of notes left to go. I can't wait to do it with you.